Today, we're taking a deep, entirely objective dive into the absolute highest stakes relationship on the planet right now, the US and China. We're going to strip away all that daily noise you hear and look directly at the hard data, the underlying historical philosophies, and the undeniable geopolitical realities that are driving these two massive superpowers. If you want to understand the true underlying mechanics of the global order, you are in the exact right place.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our cognitive map for today, showing exactly how we're going to navigate this. We'll cover 1. The profound distrust. 2. The Thucydides trap. 3. The global weigh-in. 4. Theories of civilizational decay. 5. The peak China thesis. And finally, number 6, the tech and mineral war. All right, let's get right into it. Starting with Section 1, the profound distrust. To really understand the friction between these two giants, we first need to set the scene by looking at a highly tense, very recent diplomatic encounter. Our sources highlight a fascinating event, the May 13, 2026 visit to Beijing. So the US president arrives with an absolute powerhouse delegation, literally 30 major tech CEOs. We're talking leaders from massive companies like Tesla, Apple, and NVIDIA. But instead of rolling out the red carpet, the atmosphere was just thick with profound distrust. The delegation was met at the airport merely by a vice president. And in the world of high diplomacy, that is a deliberate, glaring snub, especially when you compare it to the high-level reception Russia recently got. Inside the diplomatic compounds, it felt like a spy movie. There were rumors swirling that the waiters were actually spies, and American delegates were literally using burner phones because they were so terrified of being hacked. The whole overarching feeling? The US delegation felt entirely dominated rather than welcomed, and ultimately, absolutely zero substantial agreements materialized on critical issues like Taiwan or Iran. It was just a trip filled with symbolic snubs and deep, deep suspicion. Which brings us to Section 2, the Thucydides trap. Why is this diplomatic freeze so incredibly severe? Well, to really grasp this modern standoff, we have to put down the day-to-day news and look at things through a much wider historical lens. The diplomatic tension we just looked at, it's actually a textbook example of an ancient concept called the Thucydides trap. This term comes from Thucydides, a Greek historian who wrote about the Peloponnesian War all the way back in the 5th century BC. He famously pointed out that it was the rapid rise of Athens and the resulting sheer terror that it instilled in Sparta, the established power, that made war seem entirely inevitable. In international relations, when a rapidly rising power meets an established but maybe declining power, that convergence point is incredibly dangerous. So the crucial point is what happens when we look at the data. Political scientist Graham Allison expanded on this ancient Greek framework by looking at the last 500 years of human history. He found 16 specific instances where a rising power challenged an established global power. And get this, in 12 of those 16 times, that is a staggering 75%, the transition ended in war. So the massive heavy question we have to ask ourselves right now is, are the US and China currently locked in the 17th instance of this historical trap? Let's move to Section 3, the global weigh-in. Let's see how this all builds up by shifting our focus from ancient history to the hard modern data. Exactly how close is China to actually catching the established US power? First off, it's absolutely crucial that we don't treat this like a simple repeat of the US-Soviet Cold War. It's totally different. The Soviet Union was never truly integrated into the global capitalist economy. But China is deeply embedded. To put this in perspective, in 2024 alone, the US bought $450 billion worth of goods from China, and China bought $145 billion from the US. This creates a fascinating, high-stakes scenario of mutually assured economic destruction. If a traditional war were to break out today, both of these economies would instantly collapse. However, when we shift gears and look at sheer military muscle, the established power still holds a massive, massive lead. The US currently spends a colossal $954 billion on its military, which is roughly 3% of its entire GDP. China is in second place, spending about $360 billion. So the US is still outspending China nearly 3-to-1 to maintain that global military presence. And this brilliantly illustrates the contrast, because economically, that gap is basically vanishing. Think about this. Back in 1980, China was largely an agrarian backwater. Its economy was just 7% the size of America's. 7. Today, its nominal GDP is closing in at $18 trillion, compared to the US's $28 trillion. But look at purchasing power parity. Basically, what a citizen can actually afford locally. By that metric, China's economy is already 120% the size of the US. And in terms of global trade, China exported an astounding $3.59 trillion in goods in 2024. That is nearly double the U.S. export volume. So China is no longer just rising. Economically speaking, it has already arrived.
Moving on to Section 4, theories of civilizational decay. Now we're going to pivot a bit. Because a nation's true power isn't just about exports and military budgets, right? We have to examine the internal, structural health of both nations using some grand historical theories. Let's introduce a really fascinating concept from the 14th century political philosopher Ibn Khaldun. It's called asabiyyah. It roughly translates to social cohesion, a collective solidarity, basically that deep-seated feeling that we are all in this together. According to Khaldun, a rising power possesses incredibly strong asabiyyah, but once a civilization achieves dominance, it often slips into what he called sedentary hedonism. They start prioritizing luxury over toughness, which leads to institutional weakness and eventually civilizational decay. Fast forward a few centuries, and the historian Oswald Spengler saw these exact same patterns playing out. And our sources apply Spengler's indicators of decay directly to the modern United States. He argued that decline begins when wealth hyper-concentrates in major metropolitan cities, leaving all the provincial areas behind. It's marked by constant exhausting military overextension. Think Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Iran. It features a culture that prioritizes short-term profit way over long-term national planning. And crucially, he said it leads to Caesarism, which is where political institutions become just mere facades, and powerful, polarizing personalities swoop in and take total control. So when we actually measure modern asabiyyah, that vital social cohesion, the contrast between the two nations is pretty stark. Our sources note that back in the 1960s, about 80% of Americans trusted their institutions. Today, that number has plummeted to below 20%. The severe polarization in the U.S., which we can see playing out in extreme events like the 4 recent assassination attempts on Donald Trump, really indicates a collapsing internal solidarity. Both political extremes basically view the other as an existential threat. Conversely, the sources point out that China maintains a very tight internal cohesion. It's a highly contained system bolstered by a 90% Han Chinese demographic and thousands of years of unified Confucian values. So the internal decay that Spengler and Khaldun warned us about appears to be highly visible in the West right now while currently contained in the East. Which brings us to Section 5, the peak China thesis. But hold on, before you conclude that this global transition is just a foregone conclusion, we have to look at the other side of the coin. Because despite the internal struggles of the US, China is absolutely not invincible, not even close. Let's quickly outline the massive systemic issues that are currently stalling China's miraculous, decades-long 10% growth rate. This is what economists call the peak China thesis. First, their working-age population is rapidly shrinking due to some major demographic shifts. Second, they are sitting on a truly ballooning national debt that has reached a staggering 300% of their GDP. And third, a massive real estate implosion over recent years has literally erased roughly $18 trillion in household wealth. Because of these immense internal pressures, global institutions like the IMF are now predicting China's growth will plateau to a much, much slower 3.3%. They are hitting their own ceiling, and hitting it hard. And finally, Section 6, the tech and mineral war. So if a traditional war leads to economic collapse and both nations face deep internal vulnerabilities, where does the conflict actually happen? Well, this brings us to the climax of our explainer, the true modern battlefield of the 21st century. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer imbalance of global resources. While China possesses about 50% of the world's rare earth mineral reserves, they control an astonishing 90% of the global processing of these minerals. Let that sink in. The nation that controls these specific processing supply chains essentially holds a loaded gun to the entire global economy. And why is that 90% grip so absolutely terrifying for established powers? Because you literally cannot build the modern world without these processed minerals. And we aren't just talking about the screen on your smartphone here. We are talking about the most advanced military and consumer hardware on Earth. F-35 fighter jets, electric vehicles, the AI semiconductors that power our giant data centers, nuclear submarines, Tomahawk missiles. None of these can be manufactured without the rare earth minerals currently gatekept by China. Which brings us to the ultimate strategic standoff. The U.S. edge relies really heavily on its technological high ground.
We're talking NVIDIA's massive monopoly on high-end AI chips, incredibly advanced models like ChatGPT and Gemini, and enormous military tech investments, like the staggering $175 billion Golden Dome project. This is a plan to essentially seal U.S. airspace by 2025 using thousands of orbiting lasers and satellites. It's wild stuff. China's edge, meanwhile, relies completely on breaking those monopolies. They've sent absolute shockwaves through the tech world with low-cost, highly sophisticated AI like DeepSeek. They maintain that 90% chokehold on rare earths, and they are actively pushing for de-dollarization through economic alliances like BRICS. So we have to ask the ultimate question you should take away from this explainer. Who actually holds the keys to the 21st century? As we sit here and watch this modern Thucydides trap unfold before our eyes, will the winner be decided by traditional military might and crazy space defense? Will it be decided by ancient social cohesion and the ability to weather internal decay? Or will raw technological dominance in AI and mineral processing crown the new global leader? The data is clearly on the table, the history is well documented, but the final outcome, that is being written right now. Thank you so much for joining me today, and as always, stay curious.